There is a passage in the Bible that most pastors will not touch. A chapter so disturbing, so anatomically specific, so violently detailed, that for more than 2,000 years theologians have argued over whether it describes a creature of myth, a creature of memory, or a creature still breathing somewhere beneath the crushing silence of the deep. It is the 41st chapter of the book of Job. And it does not read like poetry. It reads like a warning. Tonight, we are going to open that warning, and we are going to look carefully at the evidence that the ancient world knew something about what moves in the abyss. Something we were never supposed to find again. The book of Job is considered by many scholars to be the oldest book in the entire Bible. Older than Genesis in its composition. Written in a language so archaic that entire Hebrew words used in chapter 41 appear nowhere else in any surviving text. Not in any inscription. Not in any clay tablet. Not in any other scroll. They exist only there, as if the writer needed vocabulary that had already been forgotten to describe something that had already been forgotten. And then the voice of God himself speaks, and he begins to describe a creature. And he asks Job a question that should make every honest reader stop breathing for a moment. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook? Can you press down its tongue with a cord? Will it make a covenant with you? Will you take it as a servant forever? The tone is not poetic. It is almost mocking, as though the very suggestion that a human being could catch, contain, or even approach this creature is absurd, laughable, insulting to the reality of what this thing actually is. And then the description begins. And this is where it stops being a story. Around its teeth, there is terror. Its back is made of rows of shields, sealed together so tightly that no air can pass between them. When it sneezes, flashes of light burst out. Its eyes are like the eyelids of the dawn. From its mouth go burning torches. Sparks of fire leap out. Out of its nostrils comes smoke, as from a boiling pot over kindled reeds. Its breath kindles coals, and a flame comes out of its mouth. Read that again, slowly, because ancient Hebrew does not waste syllables. Every single phrase was chosen. Every single image was deliberate. This is not a metaphor for a crocodile. Crocodiles do not have shields sealed with no air between them. Crocodiles do not emit light when they breathe. Crocodiles do not inspire the kind of terror that makes a chapter of Scripture shake on the page. The text continues. In its neck abides strength, and terror dances before it. The folds of its flesh stick together, firmly cast upon it, and cannot be moved. Its heart is as hard as stone, yes, hard as the lower millstone. When it raises itself up, the mighty are afraid. Because of the crashing, they are beside themselves. Listen to that phrase. When it raises itself up, the mighty are afraid. The mighty. Not ordinary men. Warriors. Kings. Men who have seen battle. Men who have killed. These men become undone at the sight of this thing rising. The sword that reaches it cannot avail, nor the spear, the dart, or the javelin. It regards iron as straw, and bronze as rotten wood. The arrow cannot make it flee. Slingstones become like stubble to it. Clubs are counted as stubble. It laughs at the threat of javelins. And then the most haunting line of all. On earth, there is nothing like it. A creature made without fear. It sees every high thing. It is king over all the children of pride. A creature, the text says, without equal on earth. A king over everything proud. And God is the one saying this. Now think carefully about the implications. Why would the creator of the universe spend an entire chapter describing a specific animal in this much anatomical detail, with this much warning, with this much insistence on its untouchability, if the animal were purely symbolic? Symbolic figures do not need anatomy. Symbolic figures do not need scales counted. Symbolic figures do not need a list of weapons that fail against them. This reads like a field report. This reads like a specimen file. This reads like something written by a witness. For centuries, rabbinical scholars treated Leviathan as something real, something that God had sealed away. In the writings of the Talmud, in the commentaries of Rashi, in the ancient Aramaic Targum, Leviathan is not a metaphor. It is described as a creature placed in the depths at the creation of the world. A creature whose eyes produce light in darkness. A creature so vast that the sage's right God keeps it restrained because, if it were ever released, it could not be contained by the sea itself. Sealed, restrained, contained. These are not words used for imaginary beings. These are words used for things that are real, and that someone, at some point, decided humanity must never meet. And here is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because the ancient Hebrews were not alone in this. In the tablets of Ugarit, discovered in the ruins of the Syrian coast in the early 20th century, there is a creature called Lotan. 7 heads. A twisting serpent of the sea. Defeated, but not destroyed. Merely bound. In the Babylonian Enuma Elish, there is Tiamat, a sea dragon older than the gods themselves, cut in half at the beginning of time, her body becoming the boundary between the heavens and the deep waters below. In Canaanite inscription fragments, there are references to a serpent called Yam, the sea itself personified as a monstrous being that had to be subdued, across cultures that had no contact with each other, across languages that did not share roots, across centuries that did not overlap. The same creature, the same location, the same warning, the deep. Do not disturb what sleeps in the deep. Archaeologists have spent decades recovering these texts. Clay tablets broken in pieces, carried out of the desert under lantern light, reassembled on laboratory tables with trembling fingers. Each fragment confirming the last. Each inscription echoing the same ancient terror. The creature is below. The creature is sealed. The creature is waiting. And now we come to the part of this story that modern science does not like to discuss. Because in the last 50 years, humanity has begun to reach depths that we were never meant to reach. The Mariana Trench, the Puerto Rico Trench, the Sunda Trench, places where the sunlight has never gone, places where the pressure would compress a human skull into fragments the size of sand, places where the water itself has been sitting undisturbed since before human civilization existed. And what have we been finding down there? Creatures with luminous eyes, creatures that produce light from their own bodies, creatures with armored plating, creatures with teeth that interlock, creatures whose scales reflect light in a way that, to the ancient eye, would have looked exactly like sparks, exactly like flame, exactly like the description in Job chapter 41. The frilled shark, a creature that researchers have called a living fossil, a creature with 300 teeth arranged in 25 rows, a creature that looks, in photographs taken from submersibles, like something drawn from a prophecy. The giant isopod, an armored creature that walks the floor of the abyss, protected by interlocking plates, plates that function exactly like the sealed shields the Bible describes. The anglerfish, a creature that carries its own light on a rod extending from its head, a creature whose mouth opens into darkness that swallows whatever approaches that lure. And deeper still, things we have only seen briefly, silhouettes passing the camera, shapes larger than our instruments can measure, objects producing acoustic signals so loud, so low, so rhythmic, that sonar operators in the 1990s named one of them simply the bloop. A sound so enormous it was detected by listening stations over 3,000 miles apart. A sound that, in the first analyses, was consistent with a living creature. A creature larger than any whale ever documented. The official explanation was eventually revised. An ice quake, they said. A glacier calving. And perhaps it was. But the point remains. The ocean is producing sounds we cannot fully explain. The ocean is producing biomass we cannot fully identify. The ocean is revealing shapes that, when overlaid against descriptions written thousands of years ago, line up with a precision that should not be possible. Because the writer of Job had no submarine. The writer of Job had no sonar. The writer of Job had no bathyscaphe, no deep-sea camera, no remotely operated vehicle capable of illuminating the lightless floor of the world. And yet the description is exact. Let us consider that possibility honestly. What if the ancient text is not describing a myth? What if it is describing an encounter? What if, at some point in the deep past, something came up from below? Something was seen. Something was documented. And the people who saw it understood, immediately, that this was not meant to be catalogued. This was meant to be warned about. The Hebrew word translated as Leviathan comes from a root meaning to twist, to coil, to wreathe. It is the same root used for things that wind themselves around other things, things that constrict, things that swallow. And the chapter ends with a declaration that should chill any honest reader. There is nothing on earth like it. It was made without fear. Made. That word is deliberate. The creature was made. It is not a symbol of chaos rising spontaneously from nothing. It is a creation that was placed somewhere, deliberately, and then, according to the older rabbinical texts, sealed. Sealed by whom? Sealed how? And sealed for how long? The book of Revelation, written thousands of years later, contains a phrase that ought to be read in direct connection to Job 41. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it. An odd phrase. Because the sea, in ancient Hebrew cosmology, was not simply water. The sea was the keeper of things that should not return. The sea was the lid on the abyss. The sea was the boundary. And Revelation says the sea will, one day, give back what it has been holding. Now combine those two ideas. Job describing a creature sealed in the deep. Revelation describing the sea releasing what it has kept. And the entire arc of Scripture begins to look less like mythology and more like a countdown. A countdown to an encounter that was postponed, not cancelled. Consider the modern explorers who have descended into the trenches. Men like Jacques Picard, who in 1960 reached the floor of the Challenger Deep and reported, in his official log, seeing a flatfish. A vertebrate. At a depth where no vertebrate was thought possible. The scientific community initially rejected his claim. Called it a mistake, called it an illusion of the lights. But Picard insisted. Until his death, he insisted. He had seen eyes looking back at him from a place where nothing with eyes should exist. Consider the sonar operators of various navies who, for decades, have logged contacts in the deepest basins of the ocean. Contacts that move. Contacts that are biological. Contacts that are not whales, not sharks, not squid, not anything on the identification chart. Most of those logs are classified. Some have leaked. All of them describe the same general profile. Very large, very deep, very patient. Consider the oil exploration crews working the deep water fields off the coast of West Africa, of Brazil, of the Gulf of Mexico. Crews who have, on multiple documented occasions, had to shut down remotely operated vehicles because something approached their cameras. Something that filled the frame. Something that did not appear on any species list. The footage, in many cases, was deleted. The drill sites were sealed. The incidents were filed away under equipment malfunction. But the ancient book of Job had already described the creature. Centuries before. Millennia before. In a language so old that half the words for its anatomy had to be invented by the writer, because the Hebrew language did not yet possess terms for what he was trying to communicate. Think about that. The writer of Job had to create vocabulary to describe this thing. That does not happen when you are writing about a known animal. That happens when you are writing about something unprecedented. Something outside the catalog of normal experience. Something that, in that moment, needed a new class of words simply to exist on the page. The chapter closes with one of the most chilling summaries in all of Scripture. It beholds every high thing. It is king over all the children of pride. Pride. That is the sin the chapter names at the very end. Leviathan is placed in the deep as a permanent rebuke to human pride. A permanent reminder that we are not, and have never been, the masters of this planet. Something else sits in the dark beneath our shipping lanes. Something else moves beneath the ordinary commerce of our lives. Something else watches, from depths we cannot survive, as we build our civilizations on a thin crust of land surrounded by water we barely understand. And the Bible is not telling us this to make us curious. The Bible is telling us this to make us afraid. Reverent. The correct word is reverent. A fear that leads to wisdom. A fear that leads to humility. A fear that understands there are thresholds the Creator drew for reasons we were not told, and that those thresholds are not suggestions. And yet, as a civilization, we are crossing them. Every year, deeper probes. Every year, more powerful sonar. Every year, more aggressive mining operations at depths that were, until recently, entirely untouched. polymetallic nodules, rare earth elements, methane hydrates. We are prying open the lid of the abyss for the sake of circuit boards and batteries. And we are doing it without any serious discussion of what the ancients, in every culture, across every continent, wrote down as a unified warning. The deep is not empty. The deep is not safe. The deep is not ours. Whatever reason Job chapter 41 exists, it exists. The chapter was preserved through wars, through exiles, through the burning of libraries, through the fall of empires. It survived because someone, at every generation, decided it was too important to lose. Why? Perhaps because the warning still applies. Perhaps because the creature described is still there. Perhaps because the seal placed upon the deep was never meant to be permanent, and the one who placed it knew, exactly, the moment at which human pride would reach down to try to pull it out. The text asks the question directly: can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook? And for most of human history, the answer was a humble no. We cannot. We dare not. We will not. But now we have fishhooks made of titanium. Now we have cables that can drop for miles. Now we have acoustic arrays that can locate biological mass at depths we could not even imagine a century ago. Now we have the technology, for the first time in the history of our species, to answer that ancient question with something other than silence. And perhaps, somewhere in the blackness below, something is stirring because of it. Something is registering the vibrations. Something is aware that the seal is thinning. The ancient writer warned us. Do not draw it out. Do not press down its tongue. Do not make a covenant with it. Do not attempt to possess it. Do not approach what was placed, deliberately, beyond your reach. This was not superstition. This was instruction. And if Job 41 is correct, if the oldest book in the Bible is telling the truth in the most literal sense imaginable, then every expedition into the trenches, every deep water drill, every sonar sweep, every probe descending into the cold, lightless places of the earth, is moving us closer to the confrontation that Scripture, in its final pages, says will one day arrive. The sea will give up what it has been holding, and what it has been holding is described, in terrible and exact detail, in a chapter written when the world was young, by a hand we no longer know, in a language that no longer lives, about a creature the Creator himself said could not be matched on earth. There is nothing like it. It was made without fear. It is king over all the children of pride. Pray, not out of superstition. Pray out of the simple, ancient, reasonable recognition that some doors were shut by a hand greater than ours. And that when Scripture takes the trouble to warn us, across thousands of years, through one of the oldest voices in the entire biblical record, we ought to listen. Because the deep remembers. The deep waits. And the deep, according to the book of Job, is not empty. It never was. There is one more detail in Job 41 that most translations soften, and that deserves, in a video like this, to be stated plainly. The original Hebrew uses a word structure that is extraordinarily rare. When God describes the creature's underside, he uses a phrase that literally means sharpened shards of pottery pressed into mud. Any who would try to grasp it from below, the text says, would be cut apart. The creature is armored everywhere. Above, rows of sealed shields. Below, jagged, broken, piercing plates. There is no part of its body that is vulnerable. There is no angle of attack that works. There is no human weapon. The chapter repeats over and over that this creature recognizes as a threat. Now why would a loving God, in the middle of a book that is supposedly about faith and suffering, take the time to describe, in obsessive anatomical detail, a creature that cannot be harmed? The answer, according to the oldest commentaries, is that the chapter is not really about the creature. It is about us. About what we are, next to what is actually in the world. About how small we are, and how small we must remain, if we are to survive spiritually. The rabbinical tradition is clear. Leviathan is not just a warning about the sea. Leviathan is a mirror held up to human pride. And the face we see in that mirror is a face that cannot survive the encounter. The chapter ends with king over all the children of pride for a reason. The creature is placed where it is, described the way it is, sealed the way it is, precisely because it corresponds to something deep in the human heart. Something that always wants to descend. Something that always wants to pry open. something that always wants to draw out with a fishhook what was never meant to be pulled to the surface. Every generation has done this in its own way, and every generation has been warned, through this chapter, that there are limits. But ours is the first generation in human history that has the technological means to ignore the warning completely. Submarines that can survive pressures of over 1,000 atmospheres. Autonomous probes that can stay at depth for months. Sonar arrays that can map the entire floor of the ocean. Mining operations that grind across the abyssal plain like industrial jaws. We are not just visitors in the deep anymore. We are residents. We are extractors. We are the fishhook. And the ancient question returns, asked in the voice of God himself, through a book so old that it predates the Hebrew language as we know it. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook? The answer, now, terrifyingly, is almost yes. Almost. Because the deep has not finished speaking. The deep has not finished revealing. Every year, new species. Every year, new signals. Every year, new footage that the labs quietly file and do not release. And every year, the gap between what ancient scripture described and what modern instruments detect gets narrower. One day, that gap will close. One day, a submersible camera will capture, clearly and without ambiguity, something that lines up, pixel for pixel, with a description written thousands of years ago in a language we barely still read. And on that day, the Book of Job will no longer be ancient mythology. It will be confirmed field research. It will be, perhaps, the oldest and most accurate zoological record ever preserved on the planet. A record left by a hand we do not know. Of a creature we were told, repeatedly, explicitly, and in the voice of God, not to seek. Let that sink in. The Bible, through one of its oldest voices, gave humanity a direct anatomical warning. And we, the children of pride, in our pursuit of knowledge, of wealth, of dominance, are steadily, carefully, with titanium and diesel and satellites, undoing the seal. There is a reason reverent fear is the beginning of wisdom. Not terror. Not paranoia. Reverence. The understanding that the Creator knows things we do not. That the Creator hid things for a reason. That the Creator, in the middle of comforting a suffering man named Job, paused the conversation to describe, in horrifying detail, something that was waiting in the water. Something that is still waiting.